Well, thank you very much for joining me in this video. I had an agent come into me the other day with a question. They were representing a buyer who was interested in buying waterfront property. There was a waterfront property listed for sale, and it advertised that it was Riparian Rights. It also said that the shoreline actually extended out 20 feet beyond the water's edge, and we wondered whether that was valid or not. But it raises this whole question of riparian rights. I think we need to talk about that briefly. The question is, when you buy a piece of waterfront property, what are you buying? And what do riparian rights really convey to you? The definition of riparian rights is that a landowner has access to bodies of water adjacent to their property. So if you have riparian rights, you can walk off your property, go swimming, go wading, put a boat in. You have access to that water. But the fact that your property seems to butt up to a lake doesn't guarantee that you actually have what you think you have, especially in cottage country. If we go north of Toronto and we're thinking of Kawarthas, we're thinking of Haliburton or Muskoka, the norm in all your navigable waterways, including rivers, but certainly lakes, was to have on shoreline road allowance, 66 feet, that belonged to the Crown. And the idea was, well, if they wanted a logging road, they had ability to do that. But also, if you were out on a lake and your boat capsized and you swam to shore, then you were guaranteed that you could crawl up onto shore and not be trespassing because you were on this lakefront unopened road allowance. Well, my parents owned a cottage. Actually, the lake was all Crown, and it was opened up in the late 50s, and some builders bought lots, built cottages, and sold them off. My parents bought one of them. I acquired it in the early 70s. And sometime later, I had a survey, and I was surprised to learn that the cottage in its entirety was sitting on this 66-foot road allowance. It wasn't on property I owned at all. Fortunately, the municipality, who had taken over control of these shoreline road allowances, had officially closed it and made provisions for cottagers to buy it if they wanted to, as long as they paid the conveyance fee and the survey and a minimal amount for the value of the land, which I did. And so all of a sudden, my cottage was sitting on my land, and I had official riparian rights because I wasn't crossing neutral territory, if you like. So where under, let's suppose this unopened road allowance or shoreline road allowance isn't a factor, where do you actually own? Where's your property line end? Does it go 20 feet into the water? Well, it could. The definition is the median high water mark. What you have is you have a varying height on a lot of waterways up in the Kawarthas and Muskoka and Haliburton, and a lot of times it's controlled at dams where they'll lift a log or drop a log because they want to control the water height further down into the trench system. And so you can have your lake height vary from season to season or day to day almost quite a bit. And depending on the configuration of the land, that means that the water's edge can move out or come in substantially. So you may or may not legally own the water edge, or you may own some land under the water, depending on the height. But the question I'm going to pose is, who actually owns the land under the water? Well, if it's a non-navigable body of water, you own it. But if it's a navigable body of water, under the Beds of Navigable Waters Act, believe it or not, Beds of Navigable Waters Act 1990, the province of Ontario owns that land under the lake. Now, under Harris's control, there were 300 and some odd parcels of land throughout the province of Ontario that were owned by M&R, and they were given over to Ontario Parks. And if Ontario Parks took control, then they owned the land under the water. Where that comes into effect is, what can you do at your shoreline? Because let's suppose you want to put in a dock. If you're putting in a dock with a crib, and that crib is going to be underwater, of course, you're building it on somebody else's land, either the government of Ontario or Ontario Parks, and certainly in the case of Ontario Parks, you can't do it without their consent. If it's a floating dock, that's a different story. But it may well be that the boathouse or the dock that you're planning on building, you need to get special consent. You may or may not be able to to build it. You need to find that out. And what can you do with the water? Well, you can drink it. You can use it for your own domestic use, but you can't necessarily use it for irrigation of your farm, well, again, without some control or consent, even though you own up to the water's edge. So as you can see, and we've only really just touched the tip of the iceberg. There's so much material here. You want to be very, very careful as a real estate salesperson. When you are listing property, this waterfront property, you want to make sure that it is, in fact, waterfront property. You want to make sure that it isn't subject to a shoreline road allowance. And in the case, for example, in St. Catharines, there's a number of properties that have water view, but there may be a bicycle path and a walking path in front of you, so you don't really own to the water's edge. Now, if it hasn't been functionally used, but it's set aside that way, you want to make sure. So you want to talk to the seller, you want to take a look at the deed, and certainly if there's a plan of subdivision, have a look at the survey and find out whether or not you have riparian rights, and find out whether you have access to the water as far as a dock is concerned. So there's a little bit of homework. Try and get it right off the get-go. I hope you find this informative. I hope, as I said, there's a lot of questions that I haven't answered, but it really gives you the notice that you really have to do some homework when you're dealing with waterfront property. I want to thank you very much for investing your time. I'll talk to you again next week.